I'm Jordan Valdina. I'm a registered architect and a professional engineer. Designing spaces and connecting people to places they love is what I do. Using the material in this program, my hope is that I may inspire and provide value to you in your journey through our built environment. This is the Architecture Show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Architecture Show. Let's talk a little bit about materials. The fundamental structural materials of buildings. Finishes are their own thing. Wall boards, paints, sidings, roofing. But let's talk about some of the fundamental structure by which we build buildings. If you go back historically far enough, you're generally going to find things that were readily available, sometimes with a little more work, but from nature, as is. Felling a tree, maybe, that's pretty work intensive compared to a bunch of boughs from a tree, or a bunch of lashed, marsh type, but sort of firm grasses that you could use, and leaves and things like this, and interlacing. So the history of fabric, right? A weave, and a lot of approaches to creating something that had a bit of a surface, which is what we need with buildings is surfaces, often relates to similar principles, not always exactly the same. Sometimes you have this, which is roofing in a nutshell, but certain huts in, for example, tropical areas would use big leaves just sort of flapping down one over the other. They'd often have cross members, though, from which to hang the leaves, which you start to see all these commonality of forms. That's how you dry leaves, like tobacco leaves, they have these bars and they hang the leaves over them. So you can imagine in some more what we often call primitive, which is a shame because of the connotations of sort of a simplicity, not an elegance in simplicity, but you could only figure out so much. Primitive. I don't know that that's really always an accurate way of seeing it, but so if we could take the connotations away and say it from the perspective of a historical and an indigenous and a where we came from, or maybe still are variously, and not as leaving a progression behind that we should be somewhere else, but just as a label to reference that state of living more directly off the land, and in its elegance, simplicity, or ignorance at times. Yes, that's possible, right? If only they understood this, they could have done that type of thing. But that's not the focus, which so often gets tagged along with it. So if you can strip that away and consciously choose to just look at, directly from the earth, how it of necessity was done at some point in the past, because there really was no other option. You didn't have big manufacturing and big, saws and big things where you could, do the same level of work. Now, of course, we always get astounded by things that were done in ancient times, like the pyramids. But this is true also of some other just magnificent scale, works of empire generally, which infers lots of people were behind some of these things, and also that a level of accumulation of knowledge took place. So to be able to orchestrate those people, and an accumulation, of course, of power. So aside from that for a second, just looking at a tribal configuration of anywhere from say 10 to 50 people or so, a little pocket community, right? Which at some point, even in the empires of old, some people somewhere would be living like that. Again, of necessity. There was no, separate builder per se. You might have, you might be an expert builder relatively. You might be more than an expert so much as recognized as, that's their passion. They focus on it. They're especially good at it. They're craftsmen more. Like artisans of somebody making a vase, you know, and they do the artwork on it. They sort of do more of that. Yeah, I know how to do it too, but I specialize more in buildings. So just imagine that sort of direct from the earth and a lot closer to it past, and to an extent that we would call primitive, which really means more directly from the earth than the advent of further tools, just as a place of starting. And then even go before that. Before that, the line is not clear exactly, but you start getting pre-even structure, and you just get into, you know, a cave. I mean, that's the joke, right? Caveman is sort of a icon of prehistoric ignorance in a sense, often is the connotation, but could we just take that judgmental part, commentary of our mind, that whatever value that has or not, and just sort of try to put it aside for a second and just look at it functionally. Just like looking at like a biologist looks at the biology of a living system, like a geologist looks at the dynamics of the geology, and there's no, wow, it was so stupid back then when it was a big molten core. You know, it just, wow, this is a sequence and a progression. If you could just look at it that way for a second, to try to evidence some of the material patterns and dynamics and basics and sort of how that works. I want to go there with this, and then take it to the present. But in a very, of course, broad stroke way. Most of what I'm doing is qualifying the looking at. So thanks for bearing with me with that. I think it's actually useful to do. To, again, try to take away the connotations and just look at the substance. Again, from the perspective of materials, from the perspective of its social significance, okay, maybe go back to the other mode. But I want to just look at the materials themselves and the approaches. So, the fundamental principles of weaving is really important when you're dealing with softer materials, especially. They have to overlap and weave, you know, and not a, you know, mono, something that where you can have a sort of a homogeneous, more or less, mixture that you spread, you know. However, that was present too in muds and clays and earths. But now you put the two together. Plant fibers are basically one aspect of them is generally there's flexibility, of course less so with a tree, more so with a bough, and even more so with grasses and reeds and things. Different ones of those would decay or dry in different ways, some of which were okay, meaning they still had a structural value. So weaving a grass skirt is not that different perhaps than somebody sort of doing a certain form of a thatched roof or a thatched wall. It's these weaves and different levels of rigidity of plant-based members generally. Now, that's the plant base. There's the earth, soil, clay related, adobes, okay? And then of course there's rock and there's stone. All of these things were the fundamental natural materials. And then you had parts of animals and things, skins, definitely. Skins are most reminiscent in their behavior of like either a woven together fabric that then becomes one flexible plane, right? A flexible plane, or a big leaf. It's related in its dynamics to a skin, which can, well, we use the word to relate to where it is in the construction of things, if you will. The skin, it's the surface. And it often requires a certain level of flexibility, depending on how you make it, like with a tent, yes, not so much with a house as we think of it. And also protection variously from the elements, shedding of water to a greater or lesser degree. And you go back far enough again, you sort of look at it from the perspective of, hey, you get the best you can, and then you gotta fall asleep. You get the best you can, and then you gotta hunker down and survive. So look at animals, there's a capitalizing on what's there already. Bedding down in tall grass. The grass creates a bit of a shelter. Shelter as a verb, to shelter. The grass shelters, and then is it a shelter? Do we let it have that noun yet? Well, it's not really, it's just a grassy field. A cave. How about a south-facing, in the northern hemisphere that is, a south-facing hollow in a hillside with some shade, but also gets the warmth of the day. Let's say that it's primarily shielded from northerly winter winds, now you have a great shelter. Is it a shelter? Yes, somehow it is, even though nobody made it. It's stable enough, continuing in its properties over time enough to qualify. Who uses that? Well, bobcats. People, I'm sure, if you were walking around in the wilderness and you were very cold and you happened upon that place and the sun was out, you'd notice. You'd notice, wow, this is good in here. Okay, so that's the real primitive. Then you start adding in a couple things, some boughs, right, a little covering, or a little more active preparation. Scooping out, let's say you have a stick, you have a staff, and maybe it's a spear point on one end and you use it for fishing or something, who knows, right? The back of the staff, maybe because you might not want to mess up the point. I mean, I don't know, it depends. Some cultures, they've had a digging bowl. You know, it's a wooden bowl that they took a lot of work to make, but now they have this fairly rigid, planar, you know, convex shape. This is really a functional tool. You know, you could, you know, eat out of it. You could dig something in the ground. Things that, not so easy with these, right? Not so easy to go digging. You can do it, takes a lot of time, messes up your fingers. So, likewise, flinting, you know, knapping rather, flint, knapping stone, you know, having a sharp edge, pressure knapping, things like bone and having a sharp edge on that. Very, you're looking at the fundamental essences of what's needed. Now, most people say, yeah, it's obvious. But knowing about it and thinking about it when you go and address the modern materials is a very fascinating continuity with the earth processes, yes, but also the fundamental physics, which is, again, that continuity can create insights sometimes where they're not there otherwise, depending on your knowledge base, etc. But also I found for people something that's sort of deeply intuitive, to an extent you almost wonder, could it be a genetic memory even related? I mean, again, certain animals instinctually know how to make a den. And so you almost wonder if some of this stuff, you start to get primitive enough in certain motion, action, form, material characteristics, and it's not even a heady subject. It's more of the reverse. Like, yeah, I could imagine, you know, sort of making that up on the fly. I get what you're saying. You know, let's look at some other things. The Earth generally is an even, you know, down underground is an even temperature. Compared to cold temperatures, it's warmer. Compared to hot temperatures, it's cooler. Shading, you know, basic fundamentals of shelter, structure, and what? Materials. Stones and related, bones, right? Hard. Plant and related, there's a crossover with wood at some point when it could be that hard. Not that it's as hard, but it's a real rigid object, all the way to a much more flexible object. Then to more flexibility in weaving, and then to mud, right? The equivalent of, and we to this day call it mud, you know, mudding a wall or mudding a joint, grout. You know, they're related ideas. It's basically clay, a clay-like, a plastic-like effect of soil mixed with the right amount of aggregate, like stone or, you know, sand or gravel or both. And this is how we make, you know, cement, concrete. The difference is what we use for mud, basically, the mud itself. Okay, so the plant matter in general has tensile strength to some degree, a resistance to pulling apart, again, given whatever force ranges it can operate within. But if you make it into a rope or a weave, and it's the right type of plant that doesn't decay to nothing when it dries, like you know, certain types of plants, reeds, etc., water-related plants don't, you have a tensile aspect. Okay, tension just being pulling. Now, what can handle pushing very well? Not the plants per se, right? It's just this stringy thing. You push it, it collapses. You pull it, it holds something. The earth, on the other hand, you push and you hit a point at which it's compact and it's very hard to keep pushing. But you can pull it right apart, right? So it's good in compression. Stone, normal, gentle forces, if you will, meaning compared to skyscrapers and the like of the modern era. But you're not going to see the stone itself have an issue with pulling apart, even though, on the scheme of things, Stone is not strong in tension. It's stronger, generally, like earth, in compression. Can resist getting crushed better than it can resist getting pulled apart. But it's not the individual stone now that matters, it's the aggregate, it's the bunch of stones. So if you're making a stone wall and the wind blows, that's creating a tensile strength, a tensile stress, force. The wind blowing here, imagine if you had a canvas stretched across a sail and the wind blows this way, it's pulling it taut. So you can see more of the tensile force. With a stone wall, you can't see the tensile forces, but it's pulling tension across these things that are loose, which, when they're loose, like soil particles, and you pull apart, well, they just pull apart. Now, the mud, the earth component, has some tensile benefit in that instead of just gravity, now you mud up all in between, right? You grout the joints, you grout the wall. Now, that is sticking together a lot better. You can push it more, and it's harder to come apart if that mud set in a way that allowed it to hold some tension strength, and probably more than anything, just to make it act like one, up to a point. But then to improve on that, you want something fibrous that's tensile strength. The modern equivalent, or the modern, where this has evolved to, if you will, I mean, that's very common, is concrete with steel reinforcing. Steel can handle the tension, concrete can handle the compression, put the two together, nice balance for a wall. So back to the primitive materials. Those in a nutshell, that's it.
This episode continues in part 2. Key life.